it's hard for me to communicate to contemporary audiences what it was like to be queer in 1988 or 1990 when I came out. The toughness that you had to have, the resilience that you had to have, the scorn that society heaped on you was really a crucible experience for me. I'm very hard to intimidate now, and I'm grateful that young queer people don't have to have those experiences.
Hello friends, it's Elinor. Welcome to the second bonus episode of Late in 88. During our interview with historian Kevin Allen, he brought so much knowledge from a local and national level that we really couldn't fit it all into episode 2, Hometown Olympic Fever. Through his work as the founder of the Calgary Gay History Project and as author of Our Past Matters, Stories of Gay Calgary, Kevin gives us invaluable insight into Canadian queer history, the catalyst that brought the community together in the 80s, and how that has shaped the 2S LGBTQIA+ community today. Here's more from that conversation. Enjoy.
I find Calgary has a lot of charm. That said, Calgary has some interesting dynamics. In respect to queer history, Alberta was very hostile towards gay rights. And I think that made our community really special in how it took on its activism, and really the opposition sparked creativity and resilience and a real prairie sense of community that is special. Particularly the 80s, there was a real camaraderie and collectiveness that some elder gays who I've interviewed are a bit sad about that it doesn't exist anymore. That sense of a place where you go and you know everybody and they have your back.
Could you tell us more about that sense of community and what it was like in the gay community in Calgary at that time?
With decriminalization or partial decriminalization in 1969, the community started to feel brave enough to start creating their own spaces. Gay bars proliferated in the 70s, but it really expanded out in the 80s. And so there were like gay coffee shops, gay bookstores, gay restaurants, and you had this whole parallel world that intersected but not with the straight world. People just gathered for a sense of safety, that kind of protection, because culture at large in Calgary and across the country, but particularly in Calgary, was hostile to queers. Homophobia was the default kind of reaction most Canadians had, and people needed these places to relax and feel safe and comfortable.
What was that relationship like for people? Were they out with their own community within the gay community, but not out in the greater community?
So I'd say the vast majority of gay people would not be out to their families or to their workplaces. There were some. There was always the pioneers who didn't care and who were feisty and sometimes worked in industries where it was more acceptable, like the theater community in Calgary was notoriously gay and open about it. But I would say most people were really reserved and careful about how they identified. That said, AIDS was on the rise, and Calgary was very hard hit by the HIV pandemic. And that's made activists out of everybody, because you couldn't hide. If you got an AIDS diagnosis, your life was at stake. And so everything changed in Calgary in the late 80s, and AIDS was a big part of that.
Despite having relatively accepting parents, I felt like miles from the queer community. Do you think there would have been a channel for youth at that time?
Maybe a little bit later, not in the 80s. I think queer people have always been tarnished with the pedophilia brush, so I think adult queers, particularly gay men, avoided children. There were a lot of lesbian mothers, though, that would do potlucks and stuff like that back in the 80s and have family-focused events, so it was a little bit where you went. I know by the 90s, Calgary Outlink, which was back then was called Gay Lines or Lesbian Information Lines, they merged into the Gay and Lesbian Community Services Association, and they started doing youth programming by the mid-90s. So they were but these were probably high school students who felt that they needed some peer support, and some of them were not out at school, but they'd come Monday nights to the Old Y downtown and hang out and get empowered that way. A few years ago, the Queer Straight Alliance at Aberhart contacted me to do a history presentation. I went to Crescent Heights and I haven't been back to my high school since I graduated, but I opened the door and the smell, that weird high school smell was there. And I was right back to, I graduated in 88. I was right back to 1988. I was like, oh my God. But the weird thing was, sitting in a room with queer kids who are currently going to that high school and their teacher talking about queer history in Calgary, and just like they're eating it up, and I'm just like, this is so disorienting for me.
Yeah.
That, yeah, with particularly with the smell.
I am in love with the fact that there is a GSA at Eberhard. QSA, sorry.
Yeah.
QSA. Can you imagine if there was a QSA when we were there? I would have been in there like a wet shirt. Yeah. Like, it just warms my heart in the same way that, like, when I see all the baby gays go into grad together, because I didn't have that, obviously. When I see all the anti-trans hate and all the pushback and everything that's happening, I try and remember that the kids are all right. The kids are still doing all right, despite what the dinosaurs are doing. How would you describe the evolution of the queer culture in Calgary over the last 30 years?
Lesbians and gay men who had been super tight in the 70s fractured on gender lines in the 80s. Gay men were really interested in no restrictions, gay liberation stuff, and lesbians were part of the second wave feminists with like anti-pornography and issues around child custody and stuff like that. AIDS brought them back together, and lesbians really took care of the dying gay and bisexual men at the time, and that really healed something in the community. That also is when the agitation and fight for our human rights started in earnest. It's when queer became a reclaimed word around 1988 to 1990. I came out formally in 90, and so I really identify with the word queer. And queer is a word of power for me, and I love it. That's pejorative for the generations that came before us. And then we just went from victory to victory. There was a hostility back then that is hard to describe. I remember when I had just come out, I was going to gay bars all the time every weekend. Young men in pickup trucks were hunting queers with baseball bats. You had to not be by yourself, and you had to watch over your shoulder. There's a physical threat in the environment that we survived.
Those were the days that a HIV diagnosis was a death sentence, and how today that's not true anymore. And that's so powerful.
And my husband and I talk about the COVID pandemic. As scary as it was in the first few months, it was like, it's nothing to HIV AIDS. If you got the first case in Calgary was 1983, and then it just went up exponentially till 96 when the antiretroviral drugs started to work. Very few people survived their diagnoses.
My uncle died of complications from AIDS in 2012. So like he was diagnosed in the 80s, and then he and his partner were very, very lucky. They managed to live like 30 years.
Very few people diagnosed in the 80s survived. So it was almost 100% death sentence.
Yeah. But it is definitely something I think that the new generation of queers need to remember. Like, the reason there aren't a whole bunch of people of a certain age is because of literally a pandemic that struck our community. It's not because they weren't out. It's not because they're still in the closet. They are no longer with us. We need to keep these stories alive so that people remember, so that they don't slide back.
A big thanks to Kevin Allen, and thank you for listening, friends. Join our community on socials at late.in.88, and remember to follow and subscribe.
This podcast is distributed by the Women in Media Podcast Network. Find out more at womeninmedia.network.